So yeah, as I say, my name is Natasha Handley. My pronouns are she, her. I am the coordinator of Trans Leeds, which is a support and advocacy group, my tongue's not working today, for the transgender community in Leeds and the surrounding area. We do a lot of things for the community in terms of like support groups and lots of socials, but we also do things like supporting them with medical appointments, like I'll go and visit GPs with them, and also with the gender identity services. Also with employers, I do kind of act kind of like a union rep. I'll go and sit in with people in like grievance meetings and things like that. But I started doing training for the MPs in the Leeds area, and I've actually done all but one, and I'm not too sure why I haven't done that last one, but I will get to it one day. So yeah, and that started off as a very basic course and just grew from there. They kept saying, oh, you should start doing it for counsellors and things, so I did, and then we're doing it now for the NHS and for the prison service, the ambulance service, and so it really has spread around, and we've got lots of versions of it for lots of different purposes. But yeah, in this workshop we're going to be talking very much about etiquette and how to interact with trans people and to make your own workplace more trans inclusive. But to start off with that, we are going to have to talk about some of the language that we use when we're talking about the trans community. So hopefully everything works. Oh, and sorry the screen is pink. We're not too sure why that's a thing, but but no, all the content is fine. It's just a different color. So anyway, basic terminology. Hopefully you're all aware of the word transgender. It's a person who does not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. That is usually someone who was assigned male at birth and then is later transitioned to female, or is assigned female at birth and is later transitioned to male. There are a few exceptions though. But that is the basic definition of what a transgender person is. But does anybody know what cisgender means? Any hands? Well, of course you do, but no, you're not allowed. Yes?
Does it identify as either?
No, but you're kind of close, yeah?
Someone who does identify with the gender they were assigned at birth.
Fantastic, yeah. Cisgender is a person who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. Do you know where the word came from?
No.
No. Yeah, cisgender is the literal opposite of transgender in Latin. Trans means on the opposite side of, cis means on the same side of. So that's where that term originated. And so cisgender and transgender are just opposites of each other. And non-binary, just as like transgender is an umbrella term for anyone who doesn't identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, non-binary is an umbrella term for any gender identity that isn't entirely male or female. It could be that they are gender fluid. They could fluctuate around on the gender spectrum, or they could be completely off the gender spectrum, having their own gender adventure out in the ether somewhere. Or they might experience no gender at all. There's literally an infinite number of non-binary identities, and the term non-binary is an umbrella term for all of those. But transgender is also an umbrella term for non-binary people as well. And we will look at a few different gender identities in just a couple of minutes. And gender dysphoria is the distress many transgender people experience over their bodies or how their gender is perceived by others. Most people who have heard of the term gender dysphoria think of it very much to do with the physical characteristics of a transgender person's body, like there's aspects of their body that give them dysphoria, cause them distress. But it's also very strongly a social thing. For example, if you use the wrong pronouns for a trans person, or you misgender them in some other way, like you might use a name for them that they don't use anymore, that can also cause distress related to their gender, and so it is very much a social thing as well as a physiological thing. And more advanced terminology, assigned X at birth. We don't like using the term born as male or born as female, because, well, I'm an example of a trans woman, and I was assigned male at birth. But I was still a woman when I was born. It's just I was assigned, miscategorized, if you like, as male at the time. So the phrase we use is assigned X at birth. Oh, cisgender, what are you doing there? Thank you. Okay, gender expression. It's the way a person presents their gender or how it appears to others. For example, there's lots of things in society which we consider to be quite gendered. We were just talking about pink. Pink is thought to be a very feminine color. It hasn't always been. Just talking 80 years ago, pink and blue were the other way around socially. Blue was a very feminine color, pink was a very masculine color, and so our idea of what is gendered in society changes. Like, for example, trousers used to be very strongly gendered for men once upon a time, but now it's changed to be somewhat gender neutral. But then we still have things like skirts and dresses, which are considered more feminine still. We're still gendering them as female. Let's see, but yeah, it's not, trans people, they might deliberately choose the gender expressions so that people will know what gender they are, how to interact with them. But then again, as I say, because the concept of what is gendered and what isn't is kind of a social construct, they might wear just whatever is comfortable for them. And so somebody's gender expression might not be a clear indication of what their gender identity is. And so the takeaway there is basically don't assume what somebody's gender is just by looking at them. Because even if I came in today with a nice full beard, shaved head, and dressed like a lumberjack, and I said, my name is Natasha, my pronouns are she, her, I'm still Natasha, my pronouns are still she, her, regardless of what my gender expression is. So sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is who a person is attracted to in relation to their gender, typo there. So yeah, there's lots of different sexual orientations. We often think like homosexual, heterosexual, there's bisexual. I mean, we've also got others like pansexual or queer or asexual. And sexual orientation is completely independent of what gender you are. So, for example, just because I'm a woman doesn't necessarily mean that I'm attracted to men, or just because somebody is a man doesn't mean they're necessarily attracted to women. That is more common, but in the trans community it's really interesting in how there's a bit more of an even distribution of sexual orientations. There's about an equal number of people who are homosexual and heterosexual. So again, the moral of the story for sexual orientation is that just because we're transitioning doesn't mean that we're attracted to one particular sexual orientation. I'm not doing this to attract men, to sum it up basically. And transition, a social or medical process of a transgender. Yeah, a social or medical process, a transgender person moving away from the gender they were assigned at birth. Sorry, I must have rushed this bit through, but anyway, transition is a social or medical process that a transgender person goes through to reach the gender that they identify as. It's moving away from the gender that they were assigned at birth. It could be medical in the form of like HRT, hormone replacement therapy, or surgeries, but it is more importantly a social process. It's about telling people what their gender identity is, because you might have known me for 30 years as one particular gender, and so it's a matter of correcting people to tell you what my gender actually is. And sorry, we've been wrong for the last 30 years. Can you please correct various things like language around pronouns and titles, and you might want to use a different name in referring to me. So it's both a medical and social process, and most trans people, they will go through the social process, but not all trans people go through the medical side. They might not need or want things like hormones or surgery, and a lot of people, they might want it, but they're not able to have it due to other medical reasons. For example, like a hemophiliac might not be able to have surgery, for example. So yeah, again, the moral of the story on transition is a person is still the gender they say they are, regardless of whether they're on hormones or have had surgery or anything. So that's basically it for terminology, but we will talk about a few gender identities. We talked about sort of binary and non-binary identities. For binary gender identities, there's really only two for trans people. There's trans man and trans woman. Trans man is a man who has socially and or medically transitioned away from their birth assignment, and a trans woman is just the opposite, a woman who has socially and or medically transitioned away from their birth assignment. I'm an example of a trans woman. I was assigned male at birth, and I realized fairly soon that was an incorrect assessment, and so I later vocalized that I am actually a woman. And it's important to sort of realize how the words are spelt as well. So it's trans space man, trans space woman, because trans is an adjective. It's a describing word. Just like I'm a tall woman, I'm a white woman, I'm an able-bodied woman. It's so yeah, trans is an adjective. Trans men are men, trans women are women. You'll be amazed how often people get the two terms mixed up for trans man and trans woman. And so that's a really easy way to remember it. If it's a man, it's a trans man. If it's a woman, it's a trans woman. There's an infinite number of non-binary identities. It's impossible to cover them in a lifetime, let alone in half an hour. But three common examples. We've got agender, a person who has no gender identity, doesn't experience gender. Bigender, a person who has two or more genders simultaneously or separately. And then genderqueer is kind of another umbrella term for lots of other gender identities like gender fluid, where the gender is in flux, or their gender is completely off the gender spectrum. They could identify as something completely unique unto themselves. And that's kind of how we view gender nowadays. It's not so much a spectrum in relation to male and female. We think that everybody has their own unique gender, and we choose the words that best describe that gender to other people. And for most people, man and woman is probably going to be the pretty good descriptions of their gender for other people. But for a lot of other people, you find that man and woman don't sum that up entirely, and so that's where you find all the non-binary identities. Honorable mention, intersex. A person whose sex characteristics are not entirely male or female. Intersex is not a gender identity, but a sex identity, and intersex people may or may not identify as transgender. I'm mentioning that one because just as we say that gender identity isn't necessarily a binary, it isn't just the male and female options, the concept of biological sex as well isn't digital. It isn't one or the other. It's more common than people think. People with intersex conditions are as common as redheads or people with green eyes. It could relate to things like chromosomes. There are more combinations than just XX or XY. Using myself as an example, it's suspected I have a condition called Klinefelter syndrome, which means that genetically I would be XXY. So even in genetics, there's a lot of variance in beyond the binary of male and female. Hormones is another one. Polycystic ovary syndrome is a common example where a cisgender woman would have elevated levels of testosterone, and testosterone we obviously associate with men generally, and so that's something which is incongruous in a cisgender woman. Primary sex characteristics, those are what you generally use to assign somebody's sex at birth. They have a quick peek between your legs and say, it's a boy or it's a girl. But even genitalia could be ambiguous. It's not, that is definitely a penis, that is definitely a vagina. It could be something else. And of course, no two people's genitalia are going to be exactly the same. There's a lot of variance in that. And secondary sex characteristics, again, if we go back to polycystic ovary syndrome, if a cisgender woman has elevated levels of testosterone, they might get more facial hair or body hair, which again is a secondary sex characteristic that we consider male. And likewise, if a cisgender male has elevated levels of estrogen, they might develop breast tissue, which again is something which is generally characterized with women. So is that all okay for everybody? Does that all make sense? I'm sticking around for a while afterwards if anybody wants to discuss things, but I'm just going to rush through everything as fast as I can. So basic do's and don'ts. Moving on to etiquette. Pronouns and titles. Pronouns are so important to trans people, and it's the easiest thing you can do to show that you support them. A pronoun is a word that's used to refer to a person without referring to them by name. Common examples would be he, him, his, or she, her, hers. But there are other ones. For example, they, them, theirs. A lot of non-binary people do prefer to use a gender-neutral pronoun such as they, them, theirs. Sie, ze, zers is what we call a neo-pronoun. You don't see that too often. I have met one person in the UK who uses sie, ze, zers, but more often than not, a non-binary person will probably ask you to use they, them, theirs. And just like I said, don't assume somebody's gender identity based on their gender expression. Don't assume their pronouns either. So generally, I always introduce myself as Natasha, and my pronouns are she, her. We do like to make it common for people to ask each other what their pronouns are, or perhaps even wear pronoun badges if you can. I've got them on my work ID as well. And if you put them in email signatures, just to sort of make it more common practice for people to ask each other what their pronouns are. Yeah, in a similar manner, a title can be gendered as well. Mr., Ms., Mrs., some common gendered titles. Doctor isn't gendered, but there's also another gender-neutral title, which is mix, or mex, spelled MX. It's getting more widespread use, but it hasn't always. I have a friend who went to a bank a while ago, a couple of years, to update their title to something that was gender-neutral, but the bank wasn't supporting MX at the time. So for a long time, we knew our friend as Captain Thomas, because captain is gender neutral, and apparently there's no requirements to be a captain. You could be a captain of your local football team if you want. But yeah, a lot of non-binary people do use the MX title. So if you do have any influence over like databases where you're storing people's details, if you can make it so that they can support the MX pronoun, MX title, then that would be a really good thing to be more inclusive of non-binary people. So what not to say, and I'm just going to say now that all of these things have actually been said to me. These are real life examples. Are you a boy or a girl? But what were you born as? What's your real name? Don't ask a trans person, are you a boy or a girl? It's like saying, I mean, what am I even looking at here? Has the label fallen off? You know, I don't understand this. But if you want to know, say, what pronouns this person uses, just ask them, what are your pronouns? Or introduce yourself with your own pronouns and then ask them what their pronouns are. Say, hi, I'm Natasha, my pronouns are she, her, what are yours? And that's actually considered to be very polite in the trans community, and it also signals to a trans person that, you know about pronouns, I'm going to open up a bit more with you, I'm going to feel a bit more comfortable. But don't just do it to trans people, do it to everybody, because you don't know who's going to be trans. I mean, I normally say, I don't know if I'm the only trans person in the room or not. I know that's not the case, but there could be more trans people in this room. There could be people that transitioned years ago, or it could be somebody who doesn't want to transition yet. They haven't come out. So we don't actually know who is or isn't transgender. But what were you born as? This is part of the fascination that we have over trans people's genitals. Basically, we all want to know what's in our pants. And saying, because the gender we're assigned at birth is based on genitalia, generally speaking, asking somebody what were you born as is basically saying, you know, what's in your pants, or at least what used to be in your pants, for all we know. And what's your real name? Again, this isn't a performance. I'm not a drag act. The name I give you is my real name. So we're asking what your old name is. I think it was on like X Factor. Is that the one with Robbie Williams? X Factor? Yeah, he asked the trans man, oh, what your old name used to be. That's not a thing. Don't do that. Don't ask the trans person what their old name is. Just accept the name that they're giving you. What's in your pants? Have you had the surgery? Surprisingly common questions. I was at a dentist a couple of years ago, just having a teeth cleaning, and he was asking me a lot of medical related questions, you know, like what kind of medication you on, and it all seemed fairly normal. And then he asked, "What, if you don't mind me asking, have you had the surgery?" The surgery. And I just said no, because it just seemed to follow on from a lot of other medical questions. But it was only like a second later I thought, does he think it has teeth or something? Why is my dentist asking me about...
Somebody actually asked you face to face what's in your pants?
Yeah, more than once. And in fact, it's not just questions in that regard. A lot of people feel that they have, they can take liberties with trans people's bodies. We are often touched inappropriately. Oh, are those real? Or, you know, for a trans man, something similar, they often get groped. So yeah, it's kind of annoying. It's definitely a thing that happens. But yeah, take away there. Don't ask strangers to describe their genitalia to you. And don't check just to be sure. It feels like that shouldn't need to be said, but it is surprisingly a common problem. Absolutely. So, you look just like a real boy or girl. I'd never have guessed. Now, generally this is said in a supportive way. The person who's saying it does mean well. But saying you look just like a real boy or real girl, it kind of says, oh, you look like one, but you're not actually a real one. It also sort of reinforces this idea that there's a correct way for a man to look, there's a correct way for a woman to look. So it's got problems wider than just the trans community. But if you want to pay a trans person a compliment, just say, oh, you're wearing a very nice dress today. I actually love it. So that's how you pay a compliment to a trans person, rather than saying, oh, you look just like a real girl today. So, or you'd look more like a girl or a boy if you grew your hair out, if you wore more makeup, maybe if you wore dresses, or if you went to the gym, you'd look, you know, more like a man. Again, it's this idea that there's a correct way for a man or a woman to look. People saying this are generally wanting to be supportive of the trans person, but it's got problematic connotations behind the suggestions. Also, you're so brave. Now, when I was doing one of these workshops, there was a lady in a wheelchair, and as soon as that popped up, she went, oh yeah, I get that all the time. And I can totally imagine, you know, people going up to her, saying, oh, you're so brave. It's like, yes, trans people do a lot of things that take a lot of courage. They are very brave, but just going up to them and saying, "Oh, you're so brave," it feels condescending, and it kind of implies that they have a choice in this. They're doing this just to be courageous, but no, we don't have a choice. Just as the person in the wheelchair, they don't have a choice. This is just their life. So that's what not to say, but there are positive things that you can do if it works. Oh, what not to do. Okay, we haven't got there yet. Well, what not to do. These are a few other things what not to do. We've had what not to say, so this is what not to do. Outing, revealing to others that someone is transgender without their permission. This is actually illegal under Section 22 of the Gender Recognition Act 2004. Outing, revealing to someone else that someone is transgender in an official capacity, you'd be liable for a personal fine of up to £5,000. So it is really serious. And it's also considered an act of violence in the trans community because we are, thank you, we are vulnerable to a lot of violence in society. There are a lot of people who do not like us and wish us harm. And so by outing a trans person, you are possibly exposing them to harm in that sense. Also, you don't know how their friends or family are going to react. It could be that, they could lose their jobs over it potentially. This is the thing that happens. So don't out a trans person and keep somebody's trans identity confidential as much as possible. It's fine to tell other people they're trans as long as you have consent from the trans person, but besides that, just don't ever do it. Misgendering, using pronouns, title, or other language incongruent with a person's gender. For example, if you refer to me using he, him pronouns, or call me Mr. Handley, or use the name that I don't use anymore. That would be misgendering a trans person, which can trigger their gender dysphoria. If you've known a trans person for a long time using a certain set of pronouns, and now they're using a different set, for example, I used he, him pronouns for a long time. It took a while for people to get used to using she, her pronouns with me. We are generally very forgiving should you make a mistake. But if you do, then just apologize and move on. But if you're going to do that over the period of 2 years, we've got to wonder if you're trying hard enough. So that's misgendering. Dead naming, again, very much like misgendering, is referring to a trans person by a name they no longer use. So most trans people will change their name, not all of them, but most will. And again, if you're in charge of things like databases which hold people's details, get rid of the old name wherever possible, because if you don't, again, it comes back to Section 22, it could be outing them as transgender as well. And if that's in a business place, then again, that's illegal under Section 22. Okay, so now the positive stuff. What should you do? Treat trans people as people with care and compassion. That's what we want. I mean, yeah, we are quite different, but no more different than anybody else in here. That we're all going to have something that makes us unique. I'm transgender, but there's going to be something else about you, which I'm not going to be. And so we're just people. We just want to be treated just as everybody else. If you make a mistake, apologize and quickly move on. Emphasis on the quickly. If you linger on it too long, if you misgender somebody and say, "Oh, sorry, it's only because I've known you for so long as a man," that just makes the situation worse. Just say sorry, correct the behavior, and then move on. Avoid unnecessary questions around status, transition, or identity. Don't ask people what's in their pants.
That is just good advice.
That's good advice in general, isn't it? Yes.
I would advocate that.
Absolutely. But I mean, that's kind of the takeaway here, is just treat us as you would treat anybody else. If you're not sure of someone's pronouns, I've used gender-neutral language. You can't go wrong with using they, them, their pronouns for everybody. So yeah, you could use gender-neutral language, or you could just ask somebody what their pronouns are. It could be that they're wearing a pronoun badge that tells you what their pronouns are. It could be on their ID. But if you introduce yourself with your pronouns and ask them what their pronouns are, then as I say, that's considered a very polite thing to do in trans circles. If someone gives you a name that is different to their ID, use the name that they're giving you. It could be that they've not updated their ID yet. Some IDs are more difficult to update than others. So if they're giving you a name, if they're telling you a name that's different to what's on the system or on their ID, use the name that they are telling you. And speak up for us. And I say we don't know who else in this room is transgender. So, you want to be sure that everybody knows that this is going to be a trans-inclusive environment. Because the people who haven't come out yet, they might feel that they're scared to, and they want to know that they're going to be supported if and when they do. So if you hear things like transphobic jokes or something going on in the coffee room, then call it out, because you don't know who's overhearing it that is transgender. So the law, how are we doing on time, by the way? Oh, we're not doing great. Okay, so the law. The Equalities Act 2010 is the main law that protects trans people. We've talked a little bit about the Gender Recognition Act, but it's not really that important. It just lets us update our birth certificates. But the Equalities Act is what protects us from discrimination, harassment, and victimization. Types of discrimination: direct discrimination, which would be being treated worse because you're a transgender. For example, if you come out to your boss and they fire you, that is just blatantly direct discrimination. Indirect discrimination would be trans people being put at a disadvantage over cis people, not necessarily intentional. It's usually an oversight. For example, if you have gendered toilets, male and female toilets, then where is a non-binary person going to go? You see what I'm saying? So that would be a form of indirect discrimination. Harassment: humiliating, degrading, or offending a trans person for being transgender. It could be that you use a slur, God forbid, or it could even be misgendering a trans person consistently over a long period of time. As I say, we do forgive it generally, but if you're doing it constantly, then we've got to wonder whether you're even trying. So that would be would possibly be seen as harassment. And victimization: being mistreated for confronting or reporting discrimination. A common example of that I see is if somebody reports that they're being harassed for being transgender to their line manager, and the line manager decides to move the trans person to a different store. It's not confronting the problem, it's not confronting the bully, it's moving the victim. So building a trans-inclusive workplace. I do normally like to have a group discussion about people's workplaces, but this is going to be a few of the things that we look for in a trans-inclusive workplace in general. It's a one-size-fits-all. So non-gendered facilities wherever possible. As I say, that's the best way to be inclusive of non-binary people, is if you just make as many things as gender neutral as possible. Toilets are the best example because they are everywhere. An explicit transgender inclusion policy. By having a trans inclusion policy, you've got systems in place should a trans person come out or should you have trans customers, because there's things going to be related to confidentiality or for medical leave and things like that, and so it's good to have a standalone trans policy to cover all of these things. It also tells your employees and your customers that you take trans inclusion seriously by having this policy. Accommodation for non-binary identities, for example, like the MX title. If you can include that in your systems, then that helps accommodate non-binary identities. Trans people being included in diversity monitoring. Not everybody gets that right. There are ways to do it and there are ways not to do it, which we'll look at in a second. And of course, staff have trans awareness training, because a lot of this is going to be new to you. Every time I do this workshop, it's going to be with people who do want to learn, they do want to know and be good allies to trans people. But they always learn new stuff because there's no reason they would come across this information unless they have a workshop or a discussion like this. So yeah, it is important that everybody has trans awareness training at some level. So yeah, accommodation for non-binary identities. Avoid unnecessary gendering and have gender-neutral facilities wherever possible. This is a way not to do it. This is a restaurant in Leeds which has gender-neutral loos, but they label the stalls M&F. So even though it's intended to be for everybody, non-binary people aren't included because it's still gendering these gender-neutral toilets. Can anyone think of a better way of labeling toilets?
The word toilets?
Gold star. It does exactly what it says on the tin. But of course, if you want to be more inclusive of like people who are illiterate or they don't speak English, then you could just use iconography of like a urinal or a toilet. I do see those around some place, but most people just use toilets. You could also put like toilets with cubicles or toilets with urinals if you're in like a listed building where you can't change the plumbing too much. There's some places I've seen which just say what is in these facilities, but everybody is welcome to use them. So yeah, trans people being included in diversity monitoring. There is a lot of discrimination in the workplace for trans people. I think a third of employers in the UK based on a recent survey, say that they would be uncomfortable with hiring a trans person. So, yeah, there is a lot of discrimination, so it's important for there to be monitoring at all levels of the application process. This was the council a couple of years ago. Can anybody spot the obvious error in this monitoring form?
Well, no non-binary options.
Can you elaborate?
Well, there's no, it's trying to assign it to 3. There's no one that doesn't identify as any gender.
Well, kind of. Basically, transgender isn't a gender in itself. So basically, it's asking us to choose either male, female, or transgender. So, for example, I'm a transgender woman. Which one do I pick, female or transgender? So it does need to be a separate question. That is wrong. And are you going to load? Thank you. This was the University of Leeds. They did it in a really good way. Is your gender identity the same as the gender you were originally assigned at birth? That's just fantastic wording, really, really good. And there's just yes, no, or prefer not to say. That's the best way I've ever seen somebody doing it. Unfortunately, they let themselves down with the drop-down box, asking whether you're male or female. Again, there's no non-binary option. So, you know, they got 1 star. Facebook actually do it the best. They've got female, male, or they have a custom field where you can just put in any gender that you want. That's not going to be practical for most people if you're doing monitoring. But if you do include male, female, non-binary, other, if you at least include a few other options, then that's going to be a bit better. So thank you, everybody. I think we actually did it on time. Amazing. Do you have any questions? Is there anything you'd like to discuss? I know that was very fast. It's a lot to take in. I can email a PDF version of this out. Shall I email it to you?
Can you, yeah.
Okay.
Get it sent out to everyone.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, you'll have the full colour versions of this, and that'll be useful for things like language and terminology. It's always a good reference to have.
Do we get a male version as well?
A what version?
Male version.
A male version. Yeah, it comes in pink, blue, and non-binary. But yeah, as I say, I'm here for the rest of the afternoon if you want to ask anything. Any questions at all?
Just an observation. I
Yeah.
didn't realise the power of the pronoun things. I mean, obviously, clearly, I know that when you're addressing transgender man or woman, you should use the correct one. But I didn't realise that you actually stated it as a greeting or something like that.
It would be good to do.
So that was absolutely new to me, to be fair.
Absolutely. It's especially true for like non-binary people because their gender expression could be anything. It might be that their gender expression is either neutral or mixed. You don't quite know what to pick up from that. But I've also known non-binary people who present themselves entirely female or present themselves entirely male, but they still use they, them pronouns. Just like I said, if I was to come in here full lumberjack, then and I said my pronouns are she, her, you wouldn't have expected that. You wouldn't have known that unless I was to tell you. And it is surprisingly common. And non-binary people, in fact, are surprisingly common. There's a recent survey in the UK. It was the largest survey of its kind in the entire world. 14,000 people responded. Just over half of those people were non-binary. So when you're thinking of trans people, we do tend to talk about trans men and trans women. But half of trans people do appear to be non-binary in the UK. So it's always safe not to assume. And yeah, if you could put your own pronouns on display wherever you can in terms of like pronoun badges is a really good way to do it. Putting it in email signatures, again, is a really great way to do that because you have no gender cues then if you're just talking to somebody on email. Or yeah, if you've got ID badges, I see that you don't, but you know, that's another place where you could possibly put them. So yeah, any other questions?
Well, not fascinating, just thought-provoking, isn't it? The things that you just don't naturally think about. So
Yeah.
I'm sitting here, I'm now looking at the toilet door, and we've got a picture of a man and a woman on it. I'm thinking, okay, well, it doesn't need to be that. Could you say the word toilet?
It could just say the word toilet, yeah. I also work for another charity, and it's called Yorkshire Dance, and they have changing rooms. And that's always a hot topic when we're talking about trans people. But again, it's how do we include non-binary people in there? Unfortunately, it's easier said than done to just make both the changing rooms gender neutral because they are open changing rooms, they're not single or store cubicles. So what they've done as kind of like a plaster is just put on the doors that Yorkshire Downs supports gender diversity. Anyone is free to use either of the facilities that they feel most comfortable using. So although that means that they still have gender facilities, it sends the message out that people are willing to go wherever they feel most comfortable going. And it's not just for non-binary people, it's a problem for both trans men and trans women when they're going into toilet facilities. You're worried about how people are going to react to you, where they say, like in a trans woman's case, they'll say, oh, there's a man in the women's changing rooms. It's not so bad in the UK, it's very bad in America at the moment. That's a very big thing, legally speaking. But yeah, it basically makes it more inclusive of everybody by just having a sign that explicitly states that everybody is welcome to use whichever facility they feel most comfortable using.
There's a place for that as well in a lot of kind of department stores and shops where it goes back along into change. I think that's a problem. I think they need to display something like that. So there was some publicity recently around transgender wanting to go into change and then
Absolutely. Primark was a big example, and I did have a meeting with Primark regarding that. And they say they're going to do better. And I've not heard of any incidents happening since then, but of course I don't hear everything that happens in Leeds. But yeah, that is something that happens quite often. Marks and Spencer's as well, I had a meeting with fairly recently regarding these type of issues coming to us. But again, it's mostly about trans awareness, because it could be that the company has policies in place that do allow trans people to use the facilities that they feel most comfortable in, but it's not passed to the employees on the ground level, and they're the ones who cause the problems of trans people accessing these spaces. But of course, if you do have signage on the door or signage up somewhere, it does explicitly say that yes, you can come here, this is fine. In fact, you are welcome. It's not just fine. We won't just allow you. We insist. Please use whichever that you feel most comfortable in. Exactly.
Okay.
Anything else? Well, thank you, everybody. As I say, I've got some. Thank you. As I say, I've got a few leaflets on the front here. If you do want to get a more in-depth look into trans identities and sort of understanding trans people, I do workshops most months just to the public, so there's some flyers for that there, and there's also some flyers about Trans Leeds and what we do. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. I hope it doesn't last too much longer.